If immortality was real, how much could it cost before the price became too high? Eternal life is one of humanity's most enduring dreams, central to myth and folklore, often explored in modern media as well. And yet, so much of that exploration is all about what it would cost. Conflict is the foundation of any narrative, so I think it's natural. Examining the dark side of anything we dearly wish for will always be compelling. Would you agree to live for thousands of years if it meant you became an old granny prone to terrifying tantrums whenever someone reminds you of the truth? What if, despite hundreds of years of wisdom, you forever thought the height of comedy was to make a Dookie joke? This is important stuff. In all seriousness, when this idea is treated with respect, it can lead to stories which force us to reflect on truly existential themes, how brief our time is, and how we can spend it on the things which matter and move through life without regret. Reverse 1999's latest story covers this beautifully. Thank you to BluePog for sponsoring this video and for giving me early access so I can share my thoughts on it. Whenever I encounter this subject at all, one of the first things which comes to mind is the elves of Tolkien's Middle-earth. Much of The Lord of the Rings is infused with a sense of melancholy. The land is scattered with the ruins of lost eras, evil is lurking in the shadows, spreading, and the remnants of once great civilizations are distrusting and isolated. The narrative itself is a slow, inexorable descent from the innocence of the Shire towards the fires of Mount Doom. I always felt the elves were especially evocative. Despite all of their magic and the beauty of their culture, they're fading from the world, retreating across the sea to the undying lands. However, this was never the focus of the story or the center of the conflict. The elves' perspective of course shapes their involvement in the events at play, which feels like a natural consequence of their worldview, but it's a step removed from our experience. The films bring it to the forefront a little more by giving extra screen time to Arwen and Aragorn's relationship, which had been left in the appendices in the book. They showed the weight of her decision through Elrond's attempt to spare her from the sorrow she would feel upon her husband's death, but emphasized that from her perspective, what she chose was the joy of a life worth living. These themes flow naturally from the rich and nuanced world Tolkien built, and perhaps in some way, the fact that they're not central to the story makes me think about them more. At the opposite end of the spectrum is Frieren, where this idea is the soul of the story. The cost of her elven lifespan is her detachment from the world. Years fly past her like minutes do to us, so any connection she makes feels fleeting and meaningless. This led to her failure to connect with her companions during her decade journeying with Himmel's party, and then to her neglect of their friendship until it was too late. It wasn't until Himmel's death decades later that she realized how important their time together was to her, and her profound grief and regret at letting it pass her by led to a fundamental change within her. Her story going forward with Fern, with Stark, and with the others they meet along the way shows her actively trying to be present, to notice those around her, and to care about them, even when it goes against her nature. They tread the same road the hero's party followed, and her quiet grief as she relives the memories of those she's lost fuels her resolve to break her centuries of habit and do it right this time. The experience is bittersweet. She came to this more vibrant life only because of the depth of her pain at losing Himmel and then Haita, and yet the happy moments with her new companions are still colored by the knowledge that they too will fade. Fern and Stark will age and die, and before long Frieren will carry their memories the same way she carries Himmel's now. I find this perspective heartbreakingly beautiful. It's sad and uplifting in equal measure. Frieren's exploration of the costs of longevity always leads me to a greater appreciation of the life we have and the fleeting fragility of the things which make it worth living. Meanwhile, Genshin has a ton of characters whose lives are extremely long, but is very inconsistent when it comes to portraying the impact of that fact. The worst offender is probably the Traveler, an interstellar demigod, presumably millennia old, but there's such a blank slate that so far this fact is largely irrelevant. After all, they barely have a personality. They kinda get a pass since it's clearly a deliberate choice to enable self-insert into the protagonist, but this has always felt a little off to me. In contrast, the Archon's age is often central to their story, though personally I feel their execution isn't always compelling. Fontaine's story is centered around the revelation about Furina's plight and how she spent 500 years acting her heart out to save her people without an end in sight. Liyue is all about the transition of power from the old to the new, with Zhongli's stasis and state of erosion making way to a new order. But then you have Nahida, whose centuries in captivity make little difference. It serves to make her history feel more tragic, but has no lasting effects, and her story would be unchanged if she had been captive for a mere fraction of that time. And then there's also the Adepti and the Fae, where it's usually just a fact which doesn't seem to weigh on them all that much, though of course there's also Citlali, another long-lived character whose story revolves around her fear of the pain of loss. My favorite, however, has to be Baizhu. His is often overlooked. but it approaches longevity from a very different angle. His power lets him spend his own life to save others, and he seeks the secret to eternal life in the hopes of saving Changshan without dooming future generations to this fate. Most of the time, it feels more part of the setting than part of the story, but when they do bring it to the forefront, it makes for some of the most compelling tales. Reverse 1999's Spring Unending event views the longevity trope through a fresh lens which makes it even more poignant. I'll explain the setup and paint some broad strokes about the direction, but I'll avoid specific spoilers. The framing story is told through the eyes of Reed, a journalist on the trail of tales of immortality. Through her investigations, she encounters visions of the distant past, following several people in ancient China, including a Taoist called Paper Heron, a constable called Cheng Heguang, and Mayfly, a cute and curious child. Both Reed and Mayfly are Yao, spirits who can take on human form, whose natural form is an animal or a plant. One fundamental fact about the Yao is that their lives span only the time that their natural form would usually live. Since both of them are reeds, they're doomed to wither and die by the winter of their first year of life. The spark which sets this story in motion is a rumor that an ancient master will make an appearance at a fair, one who knows the method of longevity, the secret to immortal life. Yao from far and wide make their way to the town, much to the dismay of the humans there. They fear the Yao, and the constables are tasked to arrest and prosecute them. Naturally, chaos ensues. The narrative weaves in other engaging threads as well. It's very much a wuxia story, so it's filled with rivalries among competing sects, deception, confrontation, and many twists and turns which flip the story on its head. I was surprised to see Cheng take center stage for much of the runtime, but he was an engaging character with an interesting story filled with intrigue, and his perspective kept the tale grounded even amidst all the fantastical events and created space for its wuxia elements to shine. I found it particularly interesting that the major threat which ties everything together was not even hinted at until the halfway point. This meant that the first half of the quest echoed the feeling of an epic with a much wider scope, while the second half brought everything into focus and all the disparate elements clicked together in a very satisfying way. What I found most compelling about the story was how it placed different philosophies on the value of longevity in opposition to one another and raised the stakes through the starkly different perspectives of the people involved. The Yao's perspective is perhaps the most passionate. Every different type of Yao we see has a painfully short lifespan, and they are all desperate to escape their fate. They're bright, curious, passionate, and full of life, and their urgency emphasizes just how little time they have. Since their time is so short, when offered a path towards longevity which comes with great risk that they might die in the attempt, they choose to gamble the little that they have in the hopes of achieving immortality. Meanwhile, Paper Heron is our youthful yet ancient master of the art of immortality, and her longevity has left her a little detached from the world, unable to taste the joys of life and perhaps a little unfeeling too. She wants to help, but she believes in taking the safest road, and she clearly feels that a shorter but more vibrant life may have a value of its own. The process she wants the Yao to follow requires time to master, decades at the least. She would choose to protect the life they have still left to live rather than risk it all. But while Cheng's story is the least connected to this question, it encapsulates the perspective which I find resonates the most with me, perfectly summarized in 2 lines of dialogue.
You don't fear death?
I fear living in regret.
This idea echoes the thought which was always in my mind throughout. The Yao who choose to spend their lives chasing a mere hope of immortality had to forego all the joys of life along the way. For any who failed, what a waste of a precious time they had. For any who did achieve it, would it even be worth it if striving for more was all they ever knew? It reminds me of all the people chasing endless riches, never satisfied, neglecting to take the time to enjoy life along the way until they find it's too late. I always felt that the key to a happy life, regardless of its length, is to find a way to focus on the things that matter, to avoid stress over either meaningless things or ones you're powerless to change, and to find time to be present in the moment. While the story does reach a satisfying conclusion to the immediate conflict and fitting end to the villain in particular, I like that it leaves this philosophical side open to interpretation. Many of the other stories I've enjoyed which explore this subject tend to have a specific thing to say about the costs of immortality. Spring Unending feels like it seeks to ask questions instead. In the end, the one which speaks to me the most is the idea that every moment is precious, and somehow even the idea of eternal life only emphasizes that ideal. Overall, I feel like Reverse 1999 absolutely delivered once again, and I enjoyed the story a ton, especially the intriguing mysteries and engaging characters. Based on their designs, I went in expecting to be swept away by Paper Heron, but she turned out to be a little more distant, and even though I liked her as a character, I never felt truly drawn to her. Despite the moment when she realized she had been insensitive, she remained fairly constant throughout, which is thematically fitting for who she is, but which makes it harder to connect. In contrast, the emotional heart of the story turned out to be the NPC. Mayfly was adorable, and her plight made me care about the story far more than Heron or even Chung, and of course Reed echoed that aspect as well. Meanwhile, Chung's story was surprisingly dynamic. In the beginning, he came across as if he were driven by a mixture of shame and ambition, which was a little off-putting at first, but over the course of the story we saw him deal with his inner demons, and by the end his inner sense of honor and justice shone through and defined the person he became. The plot was well constructed, the artwork was fantastic, and as always I loved the accents throughout, especially having the same person speak English lines with their own authentic accent and then switch to fluent Chinese just elevates the experience to another level. This is of course what I've come to expect from Reverse 1999. The depth of the stories is consistently fantastic, and each new setting is fascinating in its own unique way, especially with its usage of historical inaccuracy as I explored in a previous video. I'm finally working my way through rereading the earlier main story chapters that I skipped in my rush to collect currency and materials, and I'm excited to share my thoughts on that in more depth in the future. What strikes me the most, looking across all these stories and more, is that they're not really about immortality at all. Tolkien's elves are about what it means to watch a world move on without you, and to know that your time in it is coming to a close. Frieren is about grief and presence and the quiet devastation of realizing too late what something meant to you. Genshin, at its best, is about the weight of responsibility and the cost of carrying it alone for far longer than any person should. And Spring Unending is about urgency, about what we do with the time we're given, and whether we spend it truly living or spend it chasing something we've decided matters more. The immortality is just the lens. What's on the other side of it is always us. I think that's why this idea keeps appearing in fiction, across cultures and centuries and genres, in forms as different as Tolkien's mythology and a gacha game's seasonal event. It's because mortality is the one experience every human being shares, and stories about the cost of escaping it are really stories about how to live with it instead. I don't think any of these stories are arguing that a shorter life is better, but they do keep arriving at the same place, that length was never really the point. A life measured only in years is being measured by the wrong thing entirely. Every moment is precious. Somehow, the idea of eternal life only makes that clearer. Until next time.